I'd like to start with just a really basic, fundamental question, and that is, would you agree that threat to habitat is one of the primary threats to fish generally and to Fraser sockeye in particular? In other words, not threats to habitat, is degrading habitat among the primary threats to fish and Fraser sockeye in particular?
I think habitat impacts and decline are a risk, a threat that is cumulative, and if current trends persist, there's going to be an ongoing decline. And I think that's significant. I think the habitat impacts are difficult to retreat or recover from, but they do, in at least my opinion, transmit to things like Fraser River sockeye in an incremental way over time. So they're not something, at least as we see them currently, that are creating catastrophic adjustments season in, season out. But over time, I would say the trend is negative, and it will have an effect because the habitat productivity has some direct bearing on the ability of the ecosystem to produce fish.
Mr. LeBlanc, Ms. Reid?
Well, I would agree that clearly habitat is an extremely important feature for the survival of fish. And so from that perspective, critically important. As far as the contribution of habitat loss to the impact on Fraser sockeye, clearly we need to maintain the habitat, but from a perspective of all the other features out there, I wouldn't say it was the most important concern at this point.
All I can say from a general perspective is that habitat is critical to and important to fish production, and if we continue the decline of the quality and quantity of habitat, it will eventually have some impact on the production of fish. How much? That is very difficult to say.
Mr. Wong, yesterday I was asking you just generally about the changes in your job that you've seen over the last 15 to 20 years. I would like to ask you, we've constantly heard about increasing complexity and multi-layered policies and directions. But my question for you is, in your opinion, is discretion, creativity, and innovation a key component of habitat management? And are these increasingly being limited by complexities as a result of policies and directions?
Well, the short answer would be yes. The discretion and creativity is important, and to some degree over the number of years there has been increased oversight and I guess management applied to operational level decisions that has added process and work to those kinds of decisions and outcomes.
Do either Mr. Reid or Ms. Reid or Mr. LeBlanc have any comment?
Yeah, I think I would have a slightly different take on the question. I think what you're asking is, and I want to confirm, do I see that with the increased essential codification of the habitat program, a reduction in innovation and creativity? Is that what you're asking?
I don't think I was getting as specific as that. Just generally, I was wondering if that staff today has less discretion and more direction from national headquarters than they did 15 to 20 years ago.
Well, I would say that under EPMP, that was one of the strategies, was to essentially support the idea of program coherence. That is to say that there's standard operating procedures and practices that need to be followed. But I don't think that necessarily takes away from innovation and creativity, and that's the point I wanted to get back to, that you can see examples of how staff work within the accepted practices and procedures and yet still deliver an area-specific and relevant program. And to me, that speaks to the idea around innovation and creativity.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Yes, we have developed a series of policy frameworks and tools from headquarters to be used across the country to address coherence, predictability, and transparency. However, there is sufficient flexibility in there to allow for discretion and also for innovation and creativity in terms of how they apply those policies.
Okay, thank you. At various times yesterday, we touched on whether no net loss was being achieved. Mr. Wong, am I correct to say that you would support the view that we are seeing a slow net loss? And I won't put words in your mouth, but I would like to ask that question again. Are we achieving no net loss today in the province?
Well, I think I spoke to that yesterday fairly directly, and in my opinion, no.
Yes.
And it's reflective of the findings of previous audits that have made that part of the outcomes or determinations that indicate that there is a net loss occurring. Rate is not necessarily been well defined, and it's been repeated as findings from the audits, and I would say that reflects current conditions in my observation.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the same question to Ms. Reid, please.
Yeah, so from a technical perspective around the loss, I think we talked yesterday about our ability to measure that loss, and we have some ways, but I don't think that we have a comprehensive program in place now to show the loss over time. So I would generally agree with Jason's views and perspectives on that, but I also want to add that I think it's important to take into account what's happening from the overall from an economic perspective in the province. That it's not surprising that as we see increases in economic development, there is going to be pressure on habitat, and that's something I spoke to yesterday about the need to ensure that balance and make sure that we've got it right, and that continues to be a challenge as the rate of development continues on.
So is it fair to say that, in your opinion, we are probably achieving no net loss? I mean, we're probably not achieving no net loss, but there's insufficient information to clarify that for certain.
I would agree with that, yes.
Mr. LeBlanc?
Yes, I would agree that we're not achieving no net loss. I think a lot of the audits that have been done and previous reports have shown that is the case. As people have mentioned, it is not well defined how much we're losing. There is an inability to measure in a comprehensive way what losses are occurring across Canada. And as Rebecca was mentioning, there's there's an increasing amount of economic development that is also increasing the threats to fish and fish habitat across Canada. So we're going to continue, if we don't take some actions to arrest the impacts.
Whether habitat loss is occurring or not. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think we have the tools right now, the indicators and the measurements and the monitoring programs out there to allow us to effectively monitor whether we are gaining, losing, or achieving a balance.
So we have the technical capabilities but not the programs in place to ensure that to get that information. Is that correct?
Yes.
I just wanted to reiterate or get Mr. Wong to reiterate something that was talked about yesterday, and that is a snapshot of the state of the habitat. From where I sit, the first thing that I would do to determine whether there's a no net loss is to figure out what's already there. Has there ever been a snapshot of the state of the habitat? Do we know what we're trying to achieve no net loss from? Has that study ever been done since the policy was implemented in 1986?
Well, I'll speak to what I can recall, and I won't. I don't want to reflect this as necessarily a comprehensive knowledge of all that might have been done in the past, but there have been a few exercises to provide some degree of benchmarking. There was an exercise undertaken when one of your clients, Mr. Langer, was with our program establishing habitat management area, I guess, definitions with a little bit of an oversight as to what were the habitat values in that area, what were the development activities within those areas, and what was the forecast for what was likely to be happening, the pressures, the priorities in those watersheds. So there have been some efforts to benchmark and document, but nothing that I would frame as sort of a comprehensive benchmark that you could go back to now and say, with some degree of certainty, are we same plus or minus from that point?
Thank you. Yesterday you agreed, but would you agree again that that's an integral key thing that must be done in order to properly determine whether we're meeting no net loss?
In my opinion, it would be very important and very helpful in terms of being able to understand how well and effectively the habitat's being managed and what the trends are, and whether there is a cause for concern and where that is, and what the point source of that would be. So yes, I'd agree that it's important.
Okay, and I'd just like to follow up on, you were talking about various studies, and you mentioned my client, Mr. Langer. Among the documents that we gave notice of is number 6 on my list. Is a briefing that Mr. Otto Langer made for the Attorney General. And within that, Mr. Langer lists numerous studies. It's actually an appendix 1 to this. Well, perhaps your version does not have the appendix, so I apologize for this, but I'll just go back to my question. My question is, given the number of studies, there's a couple that I can reference, including the Harper and Quigley studies of the early 2000s, Quadra and Dovetail consulting studies in the late 1990s. There's a study by Kistritz in 1996. There's been a lot of aerial photos about parts of habitat. Would you agree that a comprehensive assessment or determination of the state of habitat is a result of a lack of political will more than anything else?
I'm not sure I'm in a position to comment on political will. My observation is that and I think Patrice spoke to that at the outset today, it would be possible to undertake that kind of exercise and generate that product or that information, and we haven't done it. The reasons and the causes for that, I would be speculating from a government perspective. At our level, where I work, we've got a fixed number of resources, we've got work plans and priorities that we have to deliver on, and there isn't room in that to undertake this at our level, and beyond that, I don't think I can really comment.
Mr. LeBlanc, would you say that the primary hindrance to obtaining a state of the habitat as it is today is a lack of political will or political direction to do so?
I can't comment on that. I wouldn't want to make a comment on that, whether it's a political will or not. But what I can say is that when we dedicate our resources that are allocated to us by Parliament, we use them for a certain function. A large amount of, as you know, is dedicated to the review of project-by-project referrals that we receive. We are in the midst of trying to change the direction of the program to be one that looks at these kind of things and does some different things, such as standards, monitoring, and reporting on the status of habitat. We have a new direction that we're trying to go into. It's being explored now with internal to the department, and our policy framework will have to be to guide us and move us into that direction, and reinvesting some of our money to do that rather than doing project-by-project reviews.
Ms. Reid?
Well, my view is that the strategy 2 work under the wild salmon policy is a step in the right direction to do that. And so we have the methodology established. The reason we haven't made more progress, as we've discussed yesterday, is primarily a funding issue. And so to do the type of work you're proposing would be very expensive. It would require a reallocation of funds or a source of funds. And there is an intent to implement the wild salmon policy strategy 2 work completely, and as we're doing it now in an incremental way. So in order to, I think, get to where you want to go, that would be a methodology of cranking up that work.
Feel free to not put particulars to that, but very expensive, if you can give any sense in your mind of what something of this nature would cost?
We haven't done the analysis on the water on the Fraser watershed. We'd have to go back and look at that, but it would be multiple millions of dollars, certainly.
Thank you. The last question I wanted to ask about this baseline or an assessment of habitat as it exists would be a question for all of you, but I guess I'll start with Mr. Wong. Would you agree with me that an assessment of the state of habitat must look at habitat as it existed in 1986 when the policy was drafted? In other words, would you agree that if we did an assessment of habitat today and no net loss and tried to achieve no net loss from today, it would be far different than trying to achieve no net loss from 1986 and the habitat that existed at that time?
Certainly, the whatever benchmark you use to start from is going to vary over time. We have in our area been considering the idea of doing a little snapshot, a very kind of localized overview of the Shuswap Lake area as an interesting exercise. And even going back before 1986, we've been looking at something like, say, well, what kind of data can we gather from the early 1920s or something like that? Because there were some air photos done, I'm not quite sure exactly when, but early on, and looking at that over time. So I suppose it would depend on the purpose of your exercise, but if you start from today as a benchmark, then you're going to be going from a point where there's been the degree of impact that already exists on the landscape. And I could see utility in backcasting that to certain time periods, depending on what kind of reference you want to make.
Ms. Reed, Mr. LeBlanc, would you agree that no net loss as the policy exists currently today means no net loss from the state of habitat as it existed in 1986?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that as we try and implement that principle of no net loss, we need to work with what we have on an ongoing basis. And going back to 1986 may be an interesting academic exercise, but the purpose of the habitat management program is to work with our current environment, existing context. And so I would suggest a snapshot like that would likely be based on a current situation. However, I'm not a scientist, and so there may be other perspectives on that question.
The habitat policy didn't provide a baseline date at which we would start in terms of no net loss, so I can't comment on the date for that. But I think what we need to do is to establish the objectives we have for watersheds in terms of the fisheries, and are able to then decide what is needed in terms of producing those fish, in terms of habitat. So what are the priorities in terms of conservation and protection, and what are the priorities in terms of restoration? Because there could be some bottlenecks in the system that need to be addressed. So I think we need to treat these on a watershed by watershed basis.
Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Martland, I'm unsure about the extent to which I have to mark the document I brought up as an exhibit. The purpose of me bringing it up was there's a list in the Appendix 1 that I saw was put up that has a list of studies that looked at the assessment of whether no net loss was being achieved.
My suggestion, Mr. Commissioner, would be that I think we've taken the approach that where the document's used for the purpose and is needed for the purpose of questions put to a witness at a general level, that would often be marked as an exhibit in the absence of an objection. I don't know that it's been used for the purpose of a question that I've heard answered by these witnesses. So I'm open to others' views on it. I think equally, Mr. Commissioner, if you have a view one way or the other, that would assist us as well.
Is this a document we've seen? I can't
Yeah,
find it.
sorry, it's number 7 on my list that I provided. 6, thank you, that I provided. So it's.
I don't seem to have the appendix to it. I don't know if that's we didn't get it or we didn't copy it.
Yeah, I noticed that the document that he brought up.
We have an issue, a separate issue apart from whether the document was used or not, in terms of who has what. I wonder if we could simply set this aside and have a conversation with council at the break, and if it's appropriate then to have it marked as an exhibit, we can do that after the break, if that's agreeable.
Can we mark it as an exhibit for identification then?
The same difficulty arises, which is it's not clear what is being marked for identification or whether everyone has it. If Mr.
be
Harrison's in
clear
a
what I'm-
position to express exactly what is being put in as an exhibit for
Sure.
identification, that would be of assistance.
What I would like to put in as an exhibit is the brief to the Auditor General signed by, or written by Otto Langer, including the appendices, which may be listed as separate documents under the ringtail system, but they are clearly marked within the document and have all been disclosed.
Mr. Spiegelman points out that in your letter to us, we have been given your organization, 121, and what's on the screen is apparently 122.
I don't want to waste time on this, but so I'll just move on and discuss it at the break. So apologize for that. And I'm going to pick up the pace. If you can bring up Exhibit 651, please. And this is a document that was discussed yesterday, referenced as the diagnostic or the diagnostic. And I'd like to ask some questions with respect to this document. First of all, do we know who authored this document? And if you can give us a sense of who the author was?
Yeah, so that was Bonnie Ancliffe.
Okay. And I'd like to go through a couple of specifics within this document for the simple question of is the EPMP effectively protecting fish habitat? And that's, I would say that this document shows quite clear that it's not, and I will ask that question again after taking you some portions of this document. Am I correct that this document identified a number of various opportunities and losses that staff felt were being opportunities and losses as a result of the EPMP were referenced in this document? Ms. Reid?
Yes.
And on page 8 of this document, would you agree that the number one identified loss spoken about by staff was, as a result of this program, was habitat?
Yeah, so Table 2 is, were the results of focus group survey done with Habitat staff, and that's what they identified, yes.
So the number one loss that Habitat staff has identified as a result of the EPMP is loss to habitat.
That was their identified concern, yes.
And if I could, I would just like to point out number 4 on that list is credibility and trust. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excuse me, Mr. Harrison, could you just refer us to which tab in which binder this is, just so we can reference it from the desk? Thank you.
I was asking the question.
Yeah, I think it'll be tab 35 of the Commission's binder of documents that were provided.
And then at, Mr. Registrar, at page 11, table 4, there is described as barriers, identified barriers to acceptance and action of the EPMP, excuse me. Ms. Reid, would you agree with me that the first 5 identified barriers to acceptance were a lack of, number 1 being a lack of success indicators, i.e. not seeing the benefits or value of EPMP, number 2 being personal beliefs or value conflicts with EPMP, number 3 being EPMP perceived as lowering the bar on habitat protection, number 4, staff don't buy into the rationale or understand the need for change, and number 5, staff don't see the link from EPMP to National Habitat Management Policy.
Yes, that was the outcome of the discussions with staff. And as I explained yesterday, I think it's important to reiterate that the implementation of EPMP in the Pacific region was difficult, and certainly there was issues around implementing a change. And so what this document, this diagnosis, was intended to do was to identify the concerns to work towards effecting that change.
I'd just like to actually go to one more portion of this document on page 14. There's 2 parts I'd like to read out. This is the top the beginning of that first paragraph. It says the EPMP model was supported by several habitat practitioners with the caveat that the tools are too primitive to permit effective and efficient fish habitat protection. In other words, it received support from some with the express acknowledgement that it did not effectively protect habitat. Is that correct?
So there was concerns around use of the operating statements. I think that's what they were talking about there.
And we focus a lot on problems, and I think for the commissioner's benefit and for everybody's benefit, it would be great to every once in a while focus on some solutions. The second paragraph of this references a potential solution, and it says that some staff were not convinced that the EPMP model has it right. They reported the model was backwards in that more time should be spent working with the middle and smaller class operators who have less resources available to hire professional help, and less time should be spent on referrals with the larger industry groups who have more resources available. I would like to ask each of you if you agree with that notion.
It speaks to what we were talking about yesterday around the values of stewardship and working with what we call low-risk projects and smaller proponents. And so that's the reason I think why it's important to have a balanced program, so that you can focus your time and energy on high-risk projects while still allowing some of that low-risk work to occur. So I think that it's not one or the other, it's a balance, and I think that's the trick, is having adequate resources in place to allow both activities to happen. And I don't think that anyone would agree that what we should do is ignore those major mine developments, those massive projects, because we're busy working on small stream projects. And so the question is how do we balance those resources? How do we have the most effective program? And that's the debate, that's the conversation that staff are having.
Yeah, I'll just add to that to say that I don't think any staff in our area would necessarily say that larger projects should not get any time from the Fisheries and Oceans Habitat Program. But I think the concern that stems from this was that the smaller projects, some of the projects that were framed as low risk were perceived, understood, perhaps to regularly result in small but cumulatively significant, potentially habitat problems. And the concern was if we were going to take those out of the realm of DFO review and input, we would have less opportunity to influence them, hopefully in a way that would be positive for fish and fish habitat. So the framing of this wasn't that it should be one over the other necessarily. It was more a concern about if we're not going to do these smaller things, that they may not result in the best possible results for the fisheries resource.
Mr. LeBlanc?
No comment on it.
Mr. LeBlanc, yesterday, I apologize, I tried to review the transcripts before, but yesterday you spoke about ENGO, Environmental Non-Government Organization consultations. And I realize I'm near my time, so I will go really quick, but did you say anything to the effect, in your view, does the ENGO community support EPMP?
Well, I would assume that they were not very supportive of it, if I recall some of the inputs that were provided. I think some of the elements of the EPMP, such as improving our monitoring capacity, everyone was quite supportive of that. The collaborative part of it, the partnering, everybody was supportive of this because it doesn't engage non-government organizations and others, so they were all pretty supportive of that because it turned into some agreements between the ENGO community and the conservation groups as well. There may have been some difference of opinion in terms of the risk management framework that was established and our focus on major projects, which you have alluded to before.
I wonder if I could introduce an exhibit at this time. It's a study that has been both referenced in the PPR and is document number 1 in my book. It's called High and Dry, an investigation of salmon habitat destruction in British Columbia, written by the David Suzuki Foundation. And my purpose for introducing this as an exhibit would be on page 14. In fact, I apologize, there's no page numbers listed on this document, so, but this document contains very clear views of what at least one ENGO, one of my clients, feels like towards EPMP.
Mr. Commissioner, Rule 27.1 indicates that the something that's referred to in the policy and practice report need not be marked as an exhibit. And this is something that's referred to in the policy and practice report, to my understanding. If there's a question, certainly I'd invite Mr. Harrison to put the question, and it may then be appropriate to mark it on that footing as well.
Well, my reason again to include it would be to support the view that the Ango community is generally against EPMP. And in the interest of time, I don't want to go to the document, but I see Mr. Taylor standing.
Well, for the reasons that Mr. Martland has pointed out, I don't think it needs to be introduced, but in any event, nothing's been done here to get it as an exhibit. It's something by some other organization who's not here as a witness.
So I would like to then read a portion of this document into the record. This is written by my client, among an organization that is my client. And at page 29 of this document, there's no page numbers, but at the very bottom, in summary, starting with in summary, it says, in summary, the David Suzuki Foundation suggests that unless DFO modifies its new habitat management plan and accepts a greater and more active role regarding its responsibility for salmon habitat conservation and protection, we will continue to see more unique populations of salmon slide into reduced levels of abundance and, worst cases, go extinct. The clock is ticking and more salmon habitat is being degraded every year. Would you agree with me, Mr. LeBlanc, that the Ango community is not supportive of this document is with respect to the EPMP? Would you agree with me that the Ango community does not support the EPMP?
Let me try to put a bit of context. The EPMP was a 3-year study as part of a continuous improvement initiative for the program. I think what they're criticizing is the overall program, not the EPMP.
Okay, thank you. I will move on.
Now that, I think, illustrates the difference of degree in my mind. If it's felt appropriate, this document, having been used for the question, might be marked as an exhibit, I think. Make that more clear. Unless other council raise an objection, I'd suggest it's appropriate to have this document marked as an exhibit.
Mr. Commissioner, I rise because I have some general concerns about the new rule and its application, and this serves to illustrate it. Apparently this document is footnoted somewhere in the PPR, although we're not told where. And we don't know what proposition it's footnoted for. In my submission on this point, it comes down to the fact that if the proper evidentiary foundation has been made in the usual course to put this document in as an exhibit of this hearing, it should be. The consequence, I think, of that will be that we got notice, apparently, of this document from my friend in the ordinary course. We were therefore alerted to this specific document. If there's something in there that some of us didn't like, and I suspect there's stuff in there that I don't like, I at least had an opportunity to deal with it. Whereas the fact that it was footnoted in the PPR was of no assistance to me, at least in that regard, and I don't think it can be to the parties. So the risk of this new rule is that documents like this are footnoted in the PPR for some obscure reason, and then the content of it could be utilized in a final report, and in effect, there wouldn't be any notice of the documents. So I think my submission is that having got it in the ordinary course as an exhibit in these proceedings, then if any or all of us want to utilize it, including the Commissioner, for whatever purpose, at least we've had notice of it and a chance to deal with it. And in my submission, the fact that it's footnoted in the PPR doesn't achieve that end.
I appreciate Mr. Prowse's point. I think that's more of a comment or complaint about a rule as opposed to something dealing with this particular question of whether this document's marked as an exhibit. Perhaps we can simply set aside that important question and have a further discussion about it, but not necessarily in the context of hearing time. And I'm also mindful we're running Mr. Harrison's clock, although perhaps we add a few minutes in fairness given that interruption.
We'll mark this for identification purposes then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to limit my questions.
That'll be marked as for identification, as W for identification.
I'm going to limit my questions, but I do have one more document that I would like to bring up. This is a document written by Mr. LeBlanc, and we sent out notice of this document later in the day, but I do note that this document was document number 1 on the Aquaculture Coalition's list. Number 2, excuse me. This is a briefing note for the Director General of Habitat Management, and it was this Canada document 0143324. This is a okay, it's up on the screen. So, Mr. LeBlanc, on page 4, would you agree that you were among the authors of this document?
Yes, I was one of the reviewers, and I approved it.
Now, on page 1 of this document, it discusses that the Director General of Habitat Management will be meeting with the Pacific aquaculture industry, and then point number 3 in the summary says that the purpose of this meeting is to improve public confidence in aquaculture and to deliver on the commitment the department has undertaken to raise public confidence in the context of aquaculture. My question for you is relatively simple. To what extent does the Director of Habitat Management deal with communications and public perceptions of industry generally and of aquaculture in particular? What percentage of your job, and not percentage, but to what extent does the Director General of Habitat Management involve him or herself in these issues?
Could you clarify that question? I'm unsure what you really are driving at in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis.
No, what I'm driving at, I guess, is that this is a meeting for the Director General to meet with an industry association to deal with public confidence in that industry, and then it states quite clearly that the purpose is to change public confidence and raise public confidence in a particular industry. So my question to you is, to what extent does DFO management generally and the Director General of Habitat Management in particular deal with public perception of industry? Is this a one-off? Is this something that comes within the job description?
I think as part of the responsibilities we have to make sure that we can describe our work in terms of protecting fish habitat for whatever industry sector we're dealing with, and ensure that there is confidence that we're doing a proper job in terms of the protection and the conservation of the resource. And whether that's 5 or 20% of the time, I'm not sure, because we do meet quite often on a regular basis with provincial agencies, NGOs, ENGOs, industry, municipalities. We advise the minister on on a regular basis in terms of ensuring her that we are doing the best we can in terms of protecting the resource.
But I guess point 3 says that DFO has explicitly committed to improving public confidence in aquaculture. Has DFO explicitly committed to improving public confidence in respect of any other industries?
No, in the context of aquaculture. So this is, we were meeting with them in terms of the requirements to protect fish and fish habitat from harmful effects. And so we needed to ensure that we wanted to be confident that we were doing the job in terms of protecting the resource.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I need to ask one more question, and this is, I apologize. Oh,
Well, I have the opposite objection now. This should be an exhibit because he failed to read parts of it, and we can make submissions later on that, but we need it as an exhibit to do it.
I would like to request that this document be made an exhibit, please.
That's the briefing note to which you're referring?
Yes.
Yes, that'll be marked as exhibit number 661.
Thank you. And the final document I wanted to get some comments to is a document identified on Commission Council's list It's number 15 on their list. And it's a one-page document that's entitled OHEB Key Issues. To be honest, I'm very near my time. I'm past my time estimate, so I plan to ask you, Mr. Wong, to go through each one of these criticisms or problems and offer a solution to each, and then to go to each other person. I do not believe we'll have time to do that, but I do want to...
Just to pick up on that concern, if I might, Mr. Commissioner, there was, in fairness, an interruption. On my accounting, there is another 5 minutes, given the late start in the estimate or allocation that Mr. Harrison had. So I think he, and given my understanding of the schedule, if he's in the 5 to 10 minute window at this point, I don't think that presents a concern for the day.
Thank you. I will definitely finish within that time. This will be the last document in line of questioning. Thank you, Mr. Martland. Mr. Wong, is this a document that you've written? Is this your document?
Yes, it is.
Can you give us a sense of when it was written?
I'm pretty sure, because when I saw it as a item for the hearings, a potential item, I started looking through my records, and it's in my electronic files from July of '07. So I assume that's when I wrote it.
Now, would you agree that this document is a sort of unguarded criticism of the problems that exist with respect to habitat, and would therefore be really useful for consideration by both the Commissioner and participants here?
Well, I definitely agree it's unguarded. It's certainly not my finest piece of work, I don't think. But I was asked about this document in preliminary interviews for the Commission hearings. And in thinking about it and trying to reflect on what it was, I believe I wrote that sort of for myself for some upcoming planning meetings that we had. And it was just sort of probably a 5 or 10 minute exercise as a snapshot around what was going on at that moment, what were some of the challenges we had, and trying to reflect on key things that we were grappling with operationally.
So in 3 minutes or less, let's go through each of these and to try to determine. I would like to hear from you if this is still a problem. Is the referral backlogs still a problem?
It is, but it's better for 2 reasons. One is there's less stuff coming in. The economic development climate has slowed down. And number 2, we have fairly recently put in place a referral triage process that we touched on briefly yesterday.
Yes.
That has helped to direct and filter some of the referral load that we have.
And is there an additional practical solution that would make it even better? Is there one thing that you can come up with quickly?
Not quickly. I'd have to think about it. There's probably lots.
Okay, well, I'll give you, think about it as we go along, maybe. Within the second criticism, you say using the results-based approach, that is EPMP, means that we don't have a handle on what is going on, and we often hear about things after the fact, making workload as investigations costly, time-consuming, and confrontational. Would you agree that's still a problem?
Yes.
Is there a solution that you can see to that?
Well, that's a fairly involved comment there, in that the work that we do exists in a very complicated context that we spoke to yesterday. But there is value in DFO engaging in a development activity before the work is undertaken. If we have the opportunity to do that, either directly by way of another agency representing something that prevents harm to habitat, or by way of guidelines or something else, then the objective is to avoid impacts before they occur by way of development. So it is happening. It was happening before when it happened when I started my career. It's happened during the course of my career. It was happening when I wrote this memo, and it's happening today. The degree changes, the source changes, and it's really hard for me to kind of give you a 1 minute answer to that.
Why don't I stop there and just stick with my comments that this is an important document that we think should be reflected upon more. Thank you. And we need to mark it as an exhibit, and I'm learning that process, so excuse me for...
We marked this as exhibit number 662.
Mr. Commissioner, I note Ms. Glowacki is next on the list. I note the time. I'm not sure if the preference is to take the break now and then reconvene, or to carry on. Thank you. And I have her estimate is under 30 minutes. It may be some ways under that. Thank you.
Lisa Glowacki for the Aquaculture Coalition. A few questions that focus on how the department actually interprets its mandate to protect fish habitat, and in particular its interpretation of what habitat means and what the concept of no net loss means. I think that the way to get into that would be to go to the memo that was just marked as Exhibit 661, or it's the briefing note for the Director General of Habitat Management. It's at tab 2 of the Aquaculture Coalition documents. Now, Mr. LeBlanc, you were asked briefly about this. When I look at this document, as you said, the purpose is to discuss how to raise public confidence and how the department is applying really habitat management to aquaculture. And there's two parts to what's under discussion. One is a set of initiatives that are really, I would describe them as public relations initiatives. And you will find them on page 2. There's public confidence, there's a heading there. And in the first paragraph, initiatives include working with like-minded cold water aquaculture producing countries, redesigning the online presence, and developing a long-term proactive strategy for raising public confidence. Would you agree with me that those are generally public relations? And by public relations, I don't mean an advertising campaign necessarily, but that they're directed at getting information out about how the department considers it to be regulating management. Is that right?
Improving communications.
Right, okay, thank you. Now the second part of this, and there doesn't seem to be any specific initiative there about changing regulation. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Now the second part of the memo, that so if we go to page 3, that's where there's outlined the discussion around the actual regulation. And the heading there is regulatory site reviews. Now, I read this, have you had an opportunity to look at this before, Mr. LeBlanc, in preparation for this?
No.
Okay. Then I'll give you my general impression of this section is that generally you and your other authors are saying that the department is doing a good job of regulating habitat management for aquaculture, but there's a challenge that is the renewal process for 97 sites that are operating, and I understand that I think their tenures are being renewed and there's a SIA holdup. Is that how you would interpret that section?
That was my understanding.
Okay. I would like to go to the first bullet under regulatory site reviews. And the department has taken, so in order to address what they consider to be a public confidence crisis and how they are regulating habitat management for aquaculture, the department's done focus group studies and tried to assess what the general public, leaving aside ENGOs, which the department considers to be perhaps unduly critical of the department's approach, and supporters within the department probably, they've done a general canvassing of what the public wants to happen. And it says here in the first bullet, focus group findings suggest that DFO's regulatory approach to aquaculture must provide for accountability and transparency using scientifically based and risk-based decision-making. This is largely how the Habitat Management Program has sought to regulate the aquaculture industry. And it continues on. And that was the opinion of yourself and the authors of this briefing note?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Now, I would just like to go to the 2004 report of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, which is it's Exhibit 88. It's tab 27 of the Commission's list. Now, I'm bringing you to this because this report of the Auditor General came out the year before this memo, and it's a general report that's, I think you would agree, quite critical of how the department is addressing habitat management, and in particular about how it is managing in relation to aquaculture. Would you agree with me? If you want to be brought to something specific, I can do that. If we move to page 1, which is page 11 of the document on the ringtail numbering. That wouldn't be the page, I think that's a Roman numeral 1. I want the actual one. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, you're right. Are you on that page, Mr. LeBlanc?
Yes, I think that the main point, 5.1.
5.1, right. And if we go to the third bullet down, there are weaknesses in regulatory approvals, enforcement, and monitoring of salmon aquaculture operations. This includes approving aquaculture site applications, assessing cumulative effects, and monitoring salmon aquaculture operations to prevent harmful destruction of habitat. So that's an overall criticism. And then if you go to page 15, please. And I will go specifically to bullet 5.75. And that paragraph reads, our current audit found that while some research has been undertaken or is ongoing, significant gaps still exist with respect to the needed research on the potential effects of salmon aquaculture in aquatic ecosystems and on wild salmon stocks. The department, through its State of Knowledge initiative, identified significant gaps in knowledge about far-field environmental effects of finfish aquaculture and the use of chemicals on finfish aquaculture in Canada. We also observed that sufficient knowledge of the risks and potential effects of salmon aquaculture on wild salmon does not exist in several areas, such as disease, sea lice, and escapes of farmed salmon from aquaculture sites.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to raise a concern that I think we're starting to stray. It may be an irresistible pull, but starting to stray into the topic of aquaculture as distinct from the overview management issues that this panel so far has been addressing. Part of the process in us achieving the work with this panel and the time we have is not heading into specific topics as much as we can avoid doing that. So I don't know, it may be that Ms. Glowacki only has one or two questions further that are topic specific. We have separate hearings on aquaculture, obviously, and so we're keen not to try and head too far down that path at this point.
I do have only a couple of questions. One is the divergence between the department's interpretation of how it applies its habitat management program and its success, and the other is about how it interprets the no net loss principle. And I think that both of those have general significance for hearing the habitat management generally.
And in that context, I think if the question is asked, and we'll, no doubt people will rise if they object, but that's helpful to appreciate. It's a few questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
So then the first question that I suggested that I would ask, I'm asking you now, and Ms. Reid, you may as well have an answer to this because I know that you've been involved in habitat management for both fisheries and aquaculture, but it seems to me, reading the 2004 report and reading this briefing note, there's a real divergence between how the department understands its success in regulating habitat management and the gaps in its scientific basis versus what the Auditor General in his review found. And I'm curious about your opinion about that.
I can't comment on that section. I do realize that we have science gaps in many things that we do, many of the activities that we regulate. It is an ongoing challenge in terms of having scientifically sound information and knowledge to be able to make support our decision. And this is just one other example of the lack of knowledge and information we may have about the interaction of aquaculture or an industry sector with fish and fish habitat.
Okay, so but the year after this Auditor General report came out, the department was proceeding on the basis that it was in fact doing a good job despite those gaps, and didn't bring to the attention of the Director General that there were those gaps that had been identified?
Well, I think that, in a sense, comparing that briefing note to the Auditor General's report is sort of comparing apples and oranges, because the purposes of the two documents are quite different. And so on the one, it was a communication piece about talking about the aquaculture industry. On the other, that talks about some specific concerns around how the program is being regulated. I think that the department understands those concerns and has put into place measures to try and improve our practices, the way that we evaluate aquaculture sites. And I think that that's likely something you'll want to get into some depth in the aquaculture session.
Right.
But to me, you're kind of comparing two things that don't really match up particularly well, because they're addressing different points.
Yeah, I recognize they're addressing different points, but one is a criticism of how the department's regulating, and the other is the department's view on how it's regulating. That's what I recognize they had different purposes, but that's the angle that I was getting at. In terms of how...
Can I just add one point?
Sure.
Just to explain kind of briefing notes.
Yeah.
Very briefly. So briefing notes, we're very constrained by how much information we can provide. We've got 3 pages to make our point, and trust me, it's really hard to do that. And so we tend to kind of really narrow in on the main point. So there may be a whole bunch of other peripheral pieces of information we simply don't have the space to raise. So where we can, we provide background, but where we really want to focus in on, here's the key message, now let's do this. That's why when you read briefing notes, you'll only get a snapshot of the particular objective of that particular note, and it's not intended to provide broad context on a whole suite of issues.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Okay, I'm not going to argue about it. So, Ms. Reid, you were talking about the department taking initiatives to address the information gaps, and so that leads me into the department's interpretation of habitat and no net loss of habitat, and I'm specifically have in mind, and like you to keep in mind, the criticism that the department lacks information about cumulative effect of aquaculture, disease and sea lice and various other impacts, which were brought up in the Auditor General report, and you were just mentioning that the department's taking initiatives to look at. So, and also I have in mind that you've all expressed a similar opinion that you doubt that the department is achieving the goal of no net loss, but you don't have a measure to know the rate at which you're losing habitat. So, at tab 7 of the Commission's list, and I'm not sure that you need to go there, but it's Exhibit 260, and it's the habitat management policy. I've read the definition of fish habitat in there, and it is on page 6. It will be familiar to you, no doubt. It's parts of the environment on which fish depend directly or indirectly in order to carry out their life processes. And when you go to the Fisheries Act, and this is cited in the PPR paragraph 10, again, I don't think anyone needs to go there, is described similarly as spawning grounds and nursery rearing, food supply and migration areas on which fish depend, and it continues on directly or indirectly to carry out their life processes. And then the habitat management policy carries on to say a loss of fish habitat to determine if there's a loss of fish habitat, you would determine whether there's been an impact on the ability of the habitat, or on fish habitat, that would reduce the capability of that habitat to sustain fisheries resources. Now, when I read that and I think about there being somewhere between 150 and 200 fish farms on the coast of BC, over 100 of them on the Fraser migration route, and each of those between 10 and 20 hectares, I think to myself that it's a pretty easy calculation that there's been several thousand hectares of habitat lost. But that doesn't seem to be how the department assesses fish habitat for aquaculture, is that right?
Well, I think that when we look at a referral, in this case, a request for an aquaculture site, we consider the question of whether a HAD has been created or not. And there's a certain methodology that's used, which others would be best placed to explain, which essentially go through and determine whether the HAD has been created or not. In cases where there is a HAD calculated, the habitat policy provides provisions around compensation and the like to help achieve that no net loss. So to do a calculation of all the fish farms in British Columbia and assume that that's lost habitat is not in keeping with how we actually deliver the habitat policy.
Right, and is that a difference of interpretation that I'm trying to get at? I just read those definitions, and as a layperson, I think, well, if you're taking that amount of area, that's water that's penned in, it's on the migration route, it's feeding grounds, and wild salmon can no longer access that area. So that's just a layperson's interpretation. I understand, and Ms. Reid, you might be able to address this, and so on that basis, I would think that every fish farm would need a habitat alteration authorization. But that's not, in fact, the case, is it? In fact, most of them don't get one.
That's correct. So that's not the methodology that's been used?
Right, okay. So the method of the department is to look, I understand it, to look at benthic impacts. And by benthic, you mean deposit on the seafloor of a certain amount of chemical or biological deposit. Is that right?
So yeah, the model that's used called DEPOMOD it's a modeling methodology to determine based on benthic impacts whether a HAD's been created or not.
Right. Okay, so each time that there is a fish farm that may or may not require or is being considered for a HAD, it's determined whether or not it's will deposit above a certain level, and if not, then no HAD will be issued and it can carry on and get whatever license or permit it requires. Is that right?
So each of those, in those situations, there would likely still be a letter of advice provided around certain mitigation measures that are required to be put in place to avoid a HAD.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that approach precludes consideration of what the effects of the farm and the existence of 500,000 plus fish on passing wild salmon is, other than what gets deposited on the ground. So it can't look at the cumulative effect of all of the farms on the route. It can't consider disease and whether there can be transfer, nor can it look at sea lice and whether that affects wild salmon. Is that right?
Well, I think if you want to talk about the methodology, I would suggest that you wait for the right panel for that, because they can get into as much detail as you want. I mean, I can tell you overall, generally, how we authorize HADs.
That's what I'm asking, just on a general level, if an approach that looks at benthic impacts can consider those other effects that the Auditor General raised concerns over.
Well, what the model does, as we've already talked about, is talk about those benthic impacts. Right. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions about the renewals, but I think that I'm out of time, so I'll leave it for another participant.
I don't know why we're more generous than time today, and we usually haven't been, for sure. My math is that there is another 5 minutes remaining for Ms. Glowacki's time if she wished to use that, or whether we go to break and she then uses it.
I'd be happy to use it if I'm, yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay, I will go then back to the memo on page 3, and Ms. Reid, you joined the department in 2007, is that right? So you're after the time of this memo in 2005, right?
I joined the department in
or not the department, sorry, but the habitat management part of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. LeBlanc, I'm going to draw your attention to page 3 of the memo again. And we briefly touched on this, but if you go to the second bullet, it says, the largest problem in BC with respect to site reviews, the second bullet of the regulatory site reviews section. The largest problems in BC with respect to site reviews have been related to the processing of renewal sites. DFO transferred all 97 renewal assessments with completed screening reports for each to TC for review and decisions on January 7th, 2005. There remains no progress in finalizing these assessments or moving forward with First Nations consultation as TC plans. In the absence of any explanation from TC or proposed timelines, industry's discomfort with these delays is growing. Then if you skip down to 2 bullets below that, there's been some issues with processing of reviews for new site applications related to TC challenges to DFO screenings and conclusions on fisheries issues. This problem seems to have been resolved at the regional level. I just want to generally get, I'm not sure how much you recall about the renewals. I know that was several years ago, but can you explain to me why there were 97, what those 97 renewals were to the best of your memory, and why they were being transferred to Transport Canada?
Mr. Commissioner, I think we are getting too detailed on the topic of aquaculture. I appreciate that Mr. LeBlanc is a co-author and won't be returning in our expectation. And so if it is something that's vital to have put in through this witness as opposed to addressed otherwise, but otherwise I raise the concern that we're delving into too great detail on a topic that this panel wasn't led for the purpose of addressing.
Actually, it might be a question better for Ms. Reid then. I just generally, any details about it I will save, but generally it might be helpful to know why, and you probably know this because I understand those renewals are still outstanding, why they're being dealt with by Transport Canada versus the department.
Sure. I don't believe those renewals are outstanding, though. I believe they were completed. But the issue was that a number of farm licenses came up for renewal, and there was a question about whether, for renewal. So there's a question about whether the license or the farm would create a HAD or not, and so if there was a HAD, it would trigger the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Mm-hmm. And so using the depot mod approach, the methodology, there was a determination in those cases that there was no HAD subject to mitigation measures as outlined in the letters that were sent and that you provided in your list of documents. But SIA was still triggered because of the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and for that reason, the files were transferred to Transport Canada with letters of advice from us about how to, what steps would be required to avoid the HAD and to mitigate the impacts.
Okay. I'm fine with that. I could call up the letters to which the witness referred. I'm in the Commissioner's hand on that. I don't need to at this time either. And it would only be for the purpose that she's referred to them, and it's the 97 letters that are recommendations on those referrals. That's what you were talking about, right, Ms.
Maybe I can suggest that we have those letters put on screen. Ms. Klowacki, I believe, identified the letters, which I think are a series of nearly identical letters. And just to be clear what we're referring to, if those could be put on screen, and perhaps Ms. Reid could be asked if those are indeed the letters that were just mentioned in her answer. If that's the case, barring objections, that they be marked as an exhibit.
It's tab 4 of my list of documents.
Yes.
Thank you. Could I have those marked as an exhibit, please?
Exhibit number 663.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
We'll take the morning break, Mr. Registrar.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.